I appreciate the invitation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the great candidates who are coming out and taking a leadership role in this fight. So my name is Chris Schoor. I wrote this book with Carol Swain. It's titled Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our book before I introduce Paul, who I've had the pleasure of meeting before and who I know is going to be an excellent champion for American values and who can take this fight to Congress where we need his leadership. So just to begin, contrary to what you are hearing in the press and increasingly even during the Supreme Court justice hearings, critical race theory is in fact in K through 12 schools. So to develop this point further, it's useful to talk a little bit about what critical race theory is, because it is both an academic theory, which is what we've all heard, but it's also a series of concepts and claims. When you understand that the concepts and claims come straight from the theory, you understand why it is obviously the case that critical race theory is being taught in K through 12 schools. And I would say, in addition to that, it's now the foundation of most of our diversity training in the corporate sector. It's really pervading our society. It's in our culture. It's certainly in the arts and so forth. So, critical race theory is a neo-Marxist theory of race in American society, and what that means is that you take the conventional Marxist framework, wherein society is divided between an oppressor class and an oppressed class, right? And in conventional Marxist understanding, this is an economic elite and an economically subjected class. So you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So all of society is based on this form of class oppression. And that means that daily interactions, the religious systems, family dynamics, oppression is truly systematic. It's systemic, right? And so what we have with critical race theory essentially is just a shoehorning in of racial categories to replace economic categories. And it's from this you get the claim that racism is systemic in American society, right? And so this means that not only are the institutions racist, not only are the people racist, but your daily interactions have racism baked into the cake somehow, right? So James Lindsay gives this excellent example of how you walk into a store, right? Paul and I walk into a store at the exact same time. Our feet cross the threshold at the precise same moment. Who does the store owner address first? If he says hello to me, it's because he's denying Paul's essential humanity, right? He's saying, that's the person who I recognize as a valid customer who has a right to be here. On the other hand, if he addresses Paul first, he's saying, what are you doing at my store, right? So it's racism on both sides. You flip a coin, heads you're racist, tails you're racist, right? This is a way of approaching the world, right? It's sort of like when all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. When you see racism everywhere, you find racism everywhere. Okay, so that's the big picture theory. What are the takeaways, the little pearls of wisdom that we're being passed both in our diversity training, but I think most importantly in K through 12 schools. So I've mentioned systemic racism. Related to that is white supremacy, and here we're not talking about Jim Crow, we're not talking about slavery or apartheid, we're talking about American society as it is today, which is which by the way has laws banning racial discrimination, certainly in the government, also in large industry and so forth. And a society, by the way, that has had racial preferences under law under affirmative action for the same period of time, right? So the claim that American society is systemically racist and white supremacist is based on a backwards reasoning from, I call it Kendi-esque reasoning, from a disparity to mistreatment. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But that's the claim. From this, you then get claims regarding meritocracy and colorblindness. So judging people by neutral standards according to either the content of their character, right, or just in terms of their job performance and so forth. This is considered racist because the system as a whole is racist, and therefore, if you don't acknowledge that racism, you're pretending as though it doesn't exist, right? This is the claim, okay? And then from there, we can get into some discussion of white privilege, which is really just variation on a similar theme, right? Society benefits white people. And we can talk about, racism being not actually hating people on the basis of their racial identity or thinking they're inferior. It is those things as long as you're part of the dominant group, which is to say if you're white. So this is called the power and prejudice definition of racism. So these are some of the core concepts that come out of the critical race theory worldview, which again comes out of Marxism, right? Apologies if this is too academic, but I think it's important to understand where this stuff comes from, because these are the concepts that are being taught, oftentimes in a watered down way, to our children in the classroom, right? When the kids are taught that because of the color of their skin, they're part of an oppressor group or an oppressed group, that is critical race theory. When the black kids are taught that they're victims of society by virtue of the color of their skin, that's CRT. When the white kids are being told, put your head down when the teacher is talking to you on this, to give you this lecture on inequality, right? Because that happened in one of these schools. When students, and this happened in Nevada, are being instructed to announce their various privileges and their various, identity markers, and to rank order themselves vis-a-vis their peers in terms of how powerful and privileged they are as a social class. This is intersectionality. This is critical race theory. The point I'm making here is that you don't have to be reading law review articles from Derek Bell to be learning critical race theory. And when I say learning, when we're talking about small children, this isn't learning, this is indoctrination, right? So critical race theory, CRT, it can be a shorthand for a broad constellation of radical neo-Marxist ideologies, right? Because there's fellow travelers in the studies field and so forth. But that's what this is, and it is very much in our schools. And you can, I could open my phone right now and I can see the Montgomery County anti-racism audit that I've taken once before, just, and I'm still getting the text from them, right? It's all right in front of us. So I want to talk a little bit about why this is all absurd. And then I want to also end on what the stakes are and why it's so important that we're here, and why it's so important that we're supporting leaders who will challenge this poison, right? So why is this absurd? Okay, so Ibram X. Kendi, my favorite author, I dedicate my book to him, Ibram X. Kendi has famously made the claim that when you see racial disparities, that is sufficient evidence of racism, right? So the argument that he makes here is that if a disparity exists, racial discrimination has to have occurred, and it has to have occurred in the present day. It's not that, discrimination in the past can have these legacy effects. That's kind of obvious, right? The argument is a present day disparity is created by a present day discrimination. And we can look at all these different aspects of American life where we see disparities between groups, and this is normal. So we can talk about income, right? So if the argument is if whites earn more than blacks on average, that's white supremacy. The first question you might want to ask is why do Asians earn more than whites on average, right? If it's white supremacy. That'd be the first question. The second question is you might want to start asking questions like, what are the other characteristics of these groups that we think are relevant? So the most common age for white Americans is 58, right? The most common age in America today for black Americans, so this is modal, not mean, or median even. The most common age for black Americans is actually 27. So those of you who are nearing 58 or past 58, think back to how much money you made per year when you were 27. If you're not yet 58, pray that you make more at 58 than you made at 27. I know that I am, right? I was a grad student, I made nothing. So the point is, you're comparing two different populations, and you're focusing on, a superficial difference and claiming that that means that racism occurred somewhere. You might also want to ask, why is it that Japanese Americans make more on average than Mexican Americans? Again, same thing. You have this huge age difference. In this case, even the median age, which tends to be more compressed than modes, the median age for Japanese Americans is 50. The median age for Mexican Americans, I believe, is about 25. So again, huge differences. So how did the racism cause the income inequality? Did it make some people have more kids than others? Because that's what drives median age differences. Older populations make more on average, right? It's important to understand, and I'll give two more examples of where these disparities can't be traced to discrimination, but this is important because this is the linchpin to the entire everything is racist argument, right? It all falls apart when you're not able to reason backwards from disparities. So another one is crime statistics. Obviously, we have an incarceration gap, right? We have a fatal interactions with the police gap between young white and black Americans. In both cases, the important thing to remember is that the crime commission gap is higher when black Americans are 13 times more likely than whites to be murdered, okay? You have to have police protection for people who are at greater risk for murder. That's gonna drive up interactions with the police. There's no way around that, right? Another example is health disparities. So there's a life expectancy gap, right? This is how it looks. Asian Americans live the longest, followed by Hispanic Americans, then whites, then blacks. So it's weird that white supremacy manifests itself this way in American society, but it's weirder still that Hispanics who actually have lower rates of health insurance access are actually living longer than whites, right? And again, we know that this is not racism, you know, it's not racist nurses, it's not racist doctors. Turns out it's that Hispanics smoke less, right? Tends to help your life expectancy, right? There are a whole host of ways we could go on for hours about how disparities between groups in the United States are not simply reducible to, you know, racism somewhere in the system, right? Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about here is the stakes of this fight. And this sounds hyperbolic. It's not. The United States has a civic nationalist construction of national identity. And what that means is that we derive our sense of common nationhood from a set of values and institutions, from a shared history, right? From a commitment to these common values. And what that means is that Paul and I can stand up here and no one except the very strange people that we write about, right? But who are very unreflective of the American experience. No one but those weirdos would think that one of us is any less American than the other one. And that is not normal around the world, right? If I move to Japan and my children, I will not be Japanese, my children will not be Japanese. If they marry non-Japanese people, their children will not be Japanese. And that's not an attack on Japan. They have a different way of understanding identity, right? For us as Americans, our values is so critical to who we are, and it's why you have to understand that CRT's dagger in the heart of civic nationalism is actually an existential threat to the country. We're going to have, very soon, if we don't get a handle on this, we're going to have a generation of Americans who grow up in a school where they learn their national values, because that's, other than their parents, that's where we're taught, right? And they're not going to see fellow countrymen in each other, right? At work, on the street, you name it. And that's a recipe for national dissolution. So I want to thank the candidates who are here. I want to thank the activists above all, honestly, because everything that we do is to facilitate the parents who are in these school board meetings. It's to arm you up with the information. It's to reach it so that you can reach out to voters. I mean, really, that's, you know, as a Marine, we would say, you know, in the Marine Corps, every non-grunt field supports the grunts. The rest of, you know, the pogues support the grunts. Everything is about the infantry, right? So the infantry in this fight are these moms and dads and school boards who are challenging this, who are putting pressure on the people who are pushing this garbage, and we're just here to help. So with that, I'd like to introduce Paul. So Paul Lott is the founder of the National Society for the Advancement of Black Americans, an organization formed in the aftermath of the George Floyd riots as a needed counterbalance to the false racial narratives pushed in America today. The goal of NSABA organization is to offer realistic solutions to black poverty clusters based on actual data and history. Mr. Lott is an alumni of Harvard College, U.S. Army veteran, husband and father of 10 author and longtime education activist. Please give him a hand. Welcome Paul Lott.
I mentioned the books will be here after.
And yes, I'll be here to sign books if anyone's interested.
Okay, hopefully we can have some fun today. I tried to figure out what I was going to say, and there's really a lot to say. And you know, when you do a lot of speaking, you kind of get tired of repeating yourself. But I realize sometimes it's necessary to repeat myself. So let's look at what's going on in the country, and let's start with public education. For the first 154 years of this nation, we did not have compulsory public education. Today we think that it's always been this way, but for the majority of our history, we didn't have public schools. So the question is why, what made us decide to have public schools? Well, public school formation, compulsory education, started in 1920 and kind of wrapped itself up around 1933. And the reason, I forgot about the camera, and the reason for this is that we all know about the mass immigration through Ellis Island and the millions that came into the country before World War I. What that resulted in is people immigrated to the country and they settled in communities, segregated communities, self-segregated communities by country of origin and language. But it turned out that these self-segregating communities had the highest crime and the greatest level of poverty. And so public schools were created to give Americans a common identity. It was put together to teach a common language standard and a common history. It actually wasn't really intended for general education. The secondary mission was, as the industrial age started to roll on, the school systems took on more and more, and then they became a part of that piece. But the important thing to remember is that we had globalization, and we had segregation, voluntary segregation, and it was destroying the country. And so we went through and got rid of that to save the country. And of course, we had World War I, we had World War II, which helped to force this identity. But something happened in the late 50s and the early 60s. The establishment realized that the tool that was put together to bring people together could now be used to tear people apart. And so what you see in public schools today is they've grabbed that core mission and simply turned it on its head. And that's something that we have to reverse. So, as the government put public education into place, there were a lot of missteps. Some states, like Oregon in 1922, when they passed their laws mandating public education, they wanted to ban private education completely and force everyone into a public school system. Fortunately, the Supreme Court invalidated the law. And when it invalidated the law, it said, quote, "A child is not the mere creation of the state. Parents, because children are not a creation of the state, parents had the preeminent authority on what controlled the education of their children." And it was this Supreme Court decision that is the basis of all parents' rights rulings from the Supreme Court from then until now. Even in Virginia passed some laws that, without due process, took away parental rights. In 2013, a case went before the Virginia Supreme Court, and in the Supreme Court ruled that any law that takes away a parent's rights without due process, that law is invalid. Now, the problem that we have today is our states pass laws that are in fact invalid, but we don't challenge them in court, and so they stay in place. Did you know the Supreme Court has come down and ruled on behalf of parents in 99% of cases presented before it? But we don't bring those cases to the Supreme Court often enough. We comply. We don't act. We don't get together to litigate. So let's flip and let's talk about race. So now we have education, and now it's come back full circle to where the education system is using to propagate a racial narrative. So, as you said in our background, when I looked out and I saw the riots that were taking place, I kind of looked at all of the destruction that was taking place, all of the narrative that was taking place, and I said, well, the biggest problem that I saw is that we cannot solve a problem that we can't quantify. And I'll be honest with you, I was raised in my younger years in a majority black community. And all of the stuff that people are shocked about in CRT is what majority black communities have believed for 2 generations. There was always a de facto acceptance that there was some type of systemic racism. I grew up that way. And no one could quantify it. It was just something that kind of everyone said, everyone understood, everyone kind of went along with, without any facts. In fact, I used to tell a story and say when I was younger, I was a little racist myself, running around with all kinds of assumptions, making judgments about people that I'd never met. Until the kindergarten, I had no direct contact with a white person at all in my life, but I was fed all kinds of opinions about people that I didn't know. But something funny happened. Life kind of changed things. I went to school and I started meeting people, and when I was in the kindergarten, I ended up being best friends with this little kid. His real name, Beachy Brumball. and his parents owned the little convenience store that we used to walk past when I would walk home from school. And this kid was my best friend. And we hung out, my parents supported it or whatever. And then one day it dawned on me, my best friend's white. He's nothing like the people I was told it was like. Oh, his parents are nothing like that. In fact, it never came up. It wasn't until someone pointed it out. In fact, it was my older brother. I was like, oh, yeah, I guess Beachy is white. And so that takes us to the point, the first point I want to make. Racism is not natural. Racism is not real. I say that again. Racism is not natural. Racism is not real. And where we see it in existence, it is always a construct of the political elite. Always. And its definition changes based on the needs of that political elite. At one point in time, if you were Italian versus Greek, it was said you were a different race. In America, people don't realize there used to be 3 wages: black, white, Irish. It did. The Irish solved the problem. They were abused by law enforcement, so they grew up and became law enforcement. Ever wonder why there's so many Irish cops in New York and in Boston? True story. But it's a construct, it's simply a construct of race. If we look at history, Columbus came to America to colonize, and he was the one that conquered. But Columbus never stepped foot in North America. And people don't know Columbus was taken back to Spain in chains as a criminal for what he did to the South Americans. To the day he was dragged back onto a boat, he still thought he was in India. He was 100 miles from the Pacific Ocean, but never made it there. North America was not formed by colonists who came over to take over. North America was formed by colonists who came over seeking religious freedom. Amen. And most of the early attempts at colonizing North America, those colonies were wiped out by the indigenous population. So it wasn't the Europeans came over in violence. That didn't happen in North America. But to support a race narrative, they conflate the two together. And they look at Columbus and what happened in South America, and they apply that to North America when that never happened. It never happened. It's a work of fiction. So that's part of the narrative, the first part of the narrative that I just want to push out there. The second part of the narrative is that when we look at why blacks became slaves, blacks did not become slaves because of race. The main thread of why slavery came into existence was that most of the settlers that came to the United States came here and they had to work off the wage of being brought over. Yeah. The problem was they were working it off. And the people that ran the ship lines thought to themselves, you know, it'd be really great if we could bring people over and never let them go. Make them work forever. And they wanted to do it to the Irish. They wanted to do it to the population of Europe. But guess what? Those governments wouldn't tolerate it. And so there would be no supply of slaves. Blacks became slaves mostly because that's where the supply was. There were no uncooperative governments along the African coast. It wasn't about race, it was just business to them. They didn't care what you looked like. If the Irish government had started handing over Irishmen, the Irish would have been slaves right alongside. And that is the truth of our history. They want to talk about putting out the real history. Those are things that they need to put out there. The race narrative was put in place in order to protect an investment. Why do you think, I told this story before, what do you think about the mating habits of midgets in Papua New Guinea? No, really. What do you think about them?
I don't think about them.
You don't think about them. Why? You never heard of them, right? There's no direct connections. You don't have a little Papua New Guinea guy walking in, having a conversation with you. So how is it that white America had all of these stereotypes about black Americans, whom they had never met? Slavery was in the households of about 1 to 5% of Americans. Slaves didn't interact with white people too much. So where do the stereotypes come from? Where did these opinions come from that these Americans had, these racist Americans had, about people they'd never met or interacted? It came from the media of their day. Someone had to tell them that blacks were a certain way. Your kid did just not wake up in the morning, 10 years old, and go, wow, I don't like black people. That didn't happen. Someone had to come to that child and tell that child something was wrong with people that look like this. This is an issue with people that look like that, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to follow the money. Well, why would somebody spread all this stuff around about black people? It's because white people were uncomfortable with slavery. And so those who owned slaves and held political power needed to come up with a narrative to make the white majority go along with their financial arrangements. That was it. Racism is not natural. It was a construct of the state and the powerful elite to protect their financial investments. That is the truth, the dirty little truth about racism. That without government and the elite, it wouldn't exist substantially. So let me prove it. At the end of the Civil War, most black America had about almost 100% of poverty. 100%. Okay? So let's make the assumption the system's working against black Americans, that's why there was 100% of poverty. Go forward 100 years to 1968. So let's go from the inner Reconstruction, 1868, right? Reconstruction, and we're going to go to 1968, 100 years. During that period of time, and this was before civil rights, 66% of black poverty was eliminated. If white people were trying to keep blacks down, they weren't doing a very good job at it. Because 2/3 of black Americans had already escaped poverty by that time, which means that face-to-face, business-to-business, human-to-human, enterprise took place, and despite the burden of government trying to keep us apart, the people, at a personal level, were always working together for the prosperity of one another in their communities. And in the absence of government, because the discrimination had to be legalized because people wouldn't do it otherwise. Why do you have Jim Crow laws if people are already discriminating? You passed the law to institutionalize the discrimination. Humanity is not that randomly evil about these things. We tend to make our judgments based on our personal interactions. And we only form our big picture judgments based upon what people tell us. I always say the man of faith and the atheist, the man of God and the atheist are both people of faith, because neither one can absolutely prove their position. And without faith, we can't function as a race, as humanity. Your child, you tell your child, you teach your child a lesson. Your child does not break out tools in a notebook and has to prove everything you've taught them. Based on your relationship, they accept it on faith. Same thing in your biology class. You know, the left likes to tell us that we're unscientific by our faith, when they're living by faith. I don't know anyone who went to 10th grade biology, opened up their biology book, and proved everything that was taught in that book absolutely for themselves. What they did is they picked up a book written by someone who said they saw something. Sounds a lot like the Bible to me. But they'll say they go by fact and science, and that something's wrong with our faith. But it is their faith, in what they don't see that propagates racism, pushes racism. So let's look at some other numbers. In the midst of the firestorm of race, we get 1959, black poverty rate was about 55%, right? So, you know, there's great migration. Blacks are moving out. 90% of blacks live in the South. 47% moved north. They moved north for jobs, right? And why did they move them north for jobs? This country, during this time when we were starting up our public schools, after the immigration took place in the early 1900s, we closed our borders. Because we wanted the people that we had invited in, we wanted to give them a time to become Americans through our public school system. So what happened is it created a labor shortage. Men went to war, women went to the factories. Men came back from war, women went home. Men came and took those jobs. There were not enough white men to take those jobs. And so northern companies went south to recruit and brought blacks north into these jobs. And this is the thing, every place in this country where blacks are the poorest are the same places they were the richest in the 1960s. Think about that. So let's ask why. How did that happen? How did every place where blacks were the richest become the places where blacks are the poorest today? Well, government policy did that. Now, it's not the whole thing about, the government passed laws to destroy the black family and blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you right now, that's pretty much a bunch of crap. When you hear it, ignore it. This is the real truth. Our government got into their head that to end poverty, you had to pay people not to be poor. Rather than saying, you're hungry, let me help you earn some food, I'm going to give you food. And in our government statistics, that's classified as you escaping poverty. Because you have food, or you have shelter, you have these things. The average education, the education issue that had never been dealt with since the Civil War, black migrants came north with a 6th grade education. But that was enough to build a car, put together a toaster, build a house, run some plumbing, do all that stuff. And with closed borders, that controlled the labor rates, the labor markets. 1972, the law changed. It was the beginning of globalization and the beginning of massive amounts of immigrants being taken from poorer countries into the United States. So now there was competition for those jobs, which affected black prosperity. And then, in a twist of fate, blacks had moved north under segregation, which is why blacks were clustered in these urban communities, because of segregation. Segregation ended. So after that point, it became voluntary segregation. And then, the government decided that they were going to pay people to stay poor where they were if they lost their job. You ever wonder why we don't have ghost towns anymore? Will the jobs dry up and people move to the jobs? We don't have that anymore. When the jobs dry up, the government gets you a check to stay where the jobs will never return. Did you know that that's both the case for the poorest whites and the poorest blacks? The poorest, if you look at Appalachia, the coal mines closed. And so the government paid those people to stay where they are, even though those minds are never opening up again. And so they create systemic poverty. Same thing in West Baltimore, South Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Boston. I could keep going on. And so the government created a policy of systemic poverty, but they label it systemic racism because in the age of television, it's easy to put a television camera around where there's a bunch of black people and say, look, it's systemic racism. Never mind that the black poverty rate is below 20% now, and that 80% of blacks aren't poor. You wouldn't know that from the television, would you? And so what does that mean? We're standing here, and I'm putting this in the face of conservatives. Our problem is we're fighting a fight at their dining room table. They've served us a buffet of race, and we buy it. We argue with them in the context of their language. I can tell you for a fact that most conservatives that I talked to assumed racism was real. But the numbers don't bear it out. In the United States, if you were born poor and white from 1959 to 2018, you were 3 times more likely to stay poor than a black kid born at the same time. Poverty rate for blacks was 55% in 1958. It dropped 20% in 9 years by 1968. White poverty only dropped 8.8% starting from 18.8%. And then you look from 1968, when the last civil rights bills were passed, to 2018, black poverty fell another 14.7%. Yes, a much slower rate because so many of us were being paid to stay poor in place. But you know what happened to the white poverty? It went up 0.1%. So for 50 years, if you were born white and poor, chances are nothing was going to make your life better. Yet, by the US Census numbers, every single racial group in America, Asian, Hispanic, black, has improved over the last 60 years. That's US Census. You can Google it. Poverty, 1955 to 2019. It's their chart that shows it. It's their data. You can download the spreadsheets. I'm not making this stuff up. These are US government statistics. And I'm telling you this to shock you out of the place where you are. We don't need to start our argument fighting false problems. Now let's go back to this idea that race is a political construct, right? Something so blatantly false. How has it been established? It's been established and propagated by those who want to use race to stay in political power. Let me give you a tiny example. Do you know why we really are where we are today when it comes to race? We don't know why? Little something happened between 2006 and 2007. Poll numbers came out towards the end of Obama's first term that showed him running neck and neck. 47% was Romney. Okay? And these were settled votes. That 47% was going to vote Democrat no matter what. This other 47% were going to vote Republican no matter what. There was only a variable in the middle. And that variable in the middle were the gay community and the black community. Now in the black community, black males were trending towards voting Republican and conservative by about 30%. While black females were more in the 10%. That had to be shut down. You ever notice Obama ran on the reputation of his white mother, his white grandmother, never mentioned his black father, but all of a sudden it became real important in 2007 during the election? Race was dragged out onto the table as a way to weaponize race to guarantee the political stability of one party. And the reason why it's being pushed today is the margins in the electoral are so close. Imagine what would happen to the Democrat Party if they just simply lost 50%, 60% of the black vote nationally. They would lose every presidential election for the next 20 years. because of the margins, there's not that much play in terms of the moderates. It would be a permanent power loss. And so it's important to the Democrats and the progressives to keep race as a bargaining chip to keep us divided, because that's how you win elections. All of this queer theory that's been put into the system. Well, if you read the articles that came out at the time, 2006, 2007, the gay community also attacked the Obama administration. And they represented about a fluctuation in the voting rate of about 1.5%. Now, if you recall, when Obama was first elected president, he said marriage is between a man and a woman. And then after that poll came out, voila, eureka, he was wrong. He supported gay marriage. He supported gay rights. He put it in the ballot. He put it in our electoral process, and we have not been able to get rid of it since. Why? Because it was a political game to win votes. So is that good news? You can go home and tell your kids you were never racist. And that's true. So let me give you my definition, how I look at critical race theory. As you know, I went to Harvard, and I had a lot of friends that we used to talk about this kind of stuff back in the day when I was a Democrat. And the thing that people don't realize is that critical race theory is not based on evidence or facts or anything. So critical race theory in the simplest form to me is like this, or critical theory in general. I adopt a point of view, and then I assume it's true, and I construct a language around it to analyze a situation. Okay? My daughter comes to me and says that there's a boogeyman in the room. So I assume the boogeyman's real, and I have a vocabulary around it. She goes, well, I can see the boogeyman till the light comes on. So we call that the boogeyman is ghosting you. We're not denying the existence of the boogeyman, and we have this whole long vocabulary that, in effect, makes the boogeyman real, when it's not. Critical race theory starts with, let's assume that we can explain these things through systemic racism, which leads to white privilege, and then develop a vocabulary around it and talk about it. No evidence whatsoever. And we never make them give us evidence. We start in the middle of the conversation, we sit on their table with their buffet, and we sample their food, and then we argue with them about how it tastes bad. But what's in fact they've done is they have brought us into a complete fictional construct. You ever seen two Star Wars fans argue about who's the most powerful Jedi? That's what we're doing in critical race theory. We're arguing about fictional characters as if they're real. We're treating them as if they're real. I got news for you. You know, movies really, really hit me emotionally sometimes. But because I feel something about it, doesn't make it real. It's still a movie. And critical race theory is a very bad movie. And most Americans don't know they're sitting in a movie theater, watching fiction on a screen. And they're voting according to this fiction. And they're making personal decisions according to this fiction. They're making job decisions according to this fiction. And oh my God, they're tweeting according to this fiction. So how do we know? Let's look at some of the tenets. This is the one I think that nobody thinks about. You've heard of anti-racism, right? Okay. So you need anti-racism because white people are so powerful that they can unconsciously oppress you, which means that in your sleep, you can stop me from getting a job. And that in order for me to experience any level of success, you have to bow and give me the power to take care of myself in your sleep. If anyone wants to, I hope people realize, I wish everyone could realize that the very concept of anti-racism, if you accept it, then you accept that blacks are inferior. Because a waking black can't take care of himself because he could be stopped by a sleeping white. That's some serious power. Think about it, it's real. Think about it. Think about it. Think about the whole construct. If you take it to its logical conclusion, if you assume CRT is real, if you buy that movie and you give it the Oscar, without slapping someone on the stage, if you buy that movie, you're basically saying that blacks are so weak and inferior that no good is going to come from society until the white person allows it. And that white person has to constantly allow it, because even if he tries to ignore it, he still has the power to hold you back. When I say that to black people, they just don't know what to say to me. They usually blink their eyes and walk away muttering to themselves, because it's true. And I look at that concept when you look at oppressor and oppressed. It's the same idea. Third grader. In Virginia, when we started our fight against CRT, the simple analogy, I didn't talk about CRT, I didn't call it CRT, I didn't talk about CRT, I didn't talk about anything Marxist. I just said, okay, if you believe that idea about oppression and oppression, and your son is sitting in a class, he's 8 years old, and he has a black friend who's 8 years old, do you really want, what's going to happen in that child's life if he looks over at his black friend and says, I can't help but to oppress him, and I won't be able to stop myself? How does that white kid be his best friend? Or if that black kid looks at his white friend and says, you know what, we might be friends now, but he's going to oppress me when I get older. How is that black kid going to be that white kid's best friend? You talk about trauma in childhood. If I had thought of it, and I didn't, I actually worked with a family about a year ago, where based on this oppressor duality, she had a son, white son, who accepted it, felt that he was worthless, and killed himself. And her daughter blamed her for resisting CRT. That family's destroyed. How does a white kid grow up in a world, particularly if you're a white male, grow up in a world where you're the boogeyman always? If that doesn't make you angry at people, what won't? And what does it say to young black children in school? You're basically validating the idea that they are in fact powerless with their own lives. The number one recruiting message, I used to take off every 7th year to volunteer all over the country in predominantly black, very violent school systems. And I would move into the school system. I worked in Roxbury and Mattapan up in Massachusetts. I worked in Gary, Indiana when it was the murder capital of the world. I worked in South Chicago. I had one of my kids get shot 30 feet from my front door, shot in the head for getting an A. Because that was the only way the gangs could keep people hopeless, was to stop people from getting scholarships. And so they attacked and assaulted any child that was doing well. You know what the number one recruiting message was? That America is systemically racist. Join the gang, join us, we're your family, because if you focus on your education, it's not going to get you anywhere anyway, because the man is going to stop it. And this is the message that the Democrats and that your school district thinks should be taught to everyone. This is probably one of the most, in my view, this is the most destructive trend that this country is experiencing. It's more destructive than anything, because there may be, if this goes too far, there's no coming back from this. And the way, what you can do now is you have to fight. And it's going to have to be in the political arena, because they've passed laws to put this in the political arena. They've taken the tool that was to bring us together and made it into a tool to tear us apart. And they've passed statutes and laws that block our power. In Virginia and in Maryland, the statutes that form school boards specifically deny parents power when it comes to curricula and policies and things that are put in place. Now, originally they put it in place because they were afraid of the Catholics. They thought the Catholics would come and take over the schools. So they put in measures to block parents. We have to change that. I had a bill that I got onto the floor in the House. Now, in the subcommittee, the NEA came in and they objected to the bill. It was on cultural competency, and it was to have cultural competency repealed. They didn't object to the bill. They object to the fact that I put in 30-day notice to parents before any policies could change. It was defeated in the Senate subcommittee because the NEA representative said, quote, "We don't usually tell parents before we do things." I'm like, and she said it out loud. And they had this argument about the procedure of letting parents knowing what's going on with their kids and looking at it, evaluating policies. And they actually had this discussion out loud. I was shocked. I'm like, you're not even trying to hide it. That has to change. How does that change? That means that you have to become active enough, financially supportive enough to put people in office in your legislature that can sponsor those bills mandating parental rights. That means that you have to be aware of what's going on and be ready to form lawsuits to take it to the Supreme Court, who statistically would rule in your favor. But we never ask. We look at the cost and expense of doing it and we don't do it, whereas the left has ACLU and they have a bunch of groups already pre-established that have collected money over long periods of time to basically keep you out of government. In Loudoun County, you have to be willing to do the work. Over the last 2 years, first thing I did when I got upset about this stuff is, with my own money, I printed 10,000 door hangers and put my anti-CRT message on it. I formed my institution, my organization, and then I made friends with people who hated it as much as I did. And over that first year, we distributed 10,000 of them. I had to reorder twice. And it was educating people about CRT without actually calling it CRT. It was about talking about the principles that we know that parents won't agree to. And so Loudoun County went the way that it went because those parents were given an understanding of what was wrong at a family level with the tenets of CRT. And that's hard work. And that's maintaining relationships with your progressive or leftist friends and having conversations with them of a non-political nature based on narrow issues that affect their lives as a community. You will never ever change anyone's mind if you go into it like you're rooting for the Dallas Cowboys and they're rooting for the Washington Commanders. Both of your quarterbacks suck and none of you care. We can't fight it that way. It can't be done that way. You have to get out, you have to speak as much as you can, you have to put as much information out there as you can, but you need to mobilize for the legislature. Chris and I, we worked together in Colorblind for Life Coalition. It was a coalition of organizations, mostly across Virginia, and we looked at legislation, we looked at policy. We looked at ways, we looked at how CRT was, from a statutory standpoint, in the Virginia Department of Education of Virginia government. And we worked and we produced a report and we delivered that report to the governor and we gave the information on education and Secretary of Education. And I talked with the governor. Governor and I are personal friends. I've been an advisor to him in education policies. When he did his EO, his anti-CRT EO, masking EO, and he quoted the statute of 1-240.1, the parental rights statute in Virginia law, I gave that to him in a report in April of 2021. I said, did you know, we already have a law against this stuff, but it's untested. See, this is what you have to understand. The law works a funny way. We have a statute that gives us parental rights, But you need case law to define what that means. You ever wonder why we have a Constitution and then we have the Bill of Rights? Because the Constitution talks about our freedoms, but the reason why the founders needed the Bill of Rights is it was a new court system and there were no precedent to define what freedom was. And so they used the Bill of Rights to specifically enumerate those freedoms which were most likely to be violated by a central government. So when it comes to parents' rights, it is up to us to fight in the courts so that we can have precedent that defines the parameters, the boundaries of parental rights. The reason why the left can just do what they want to do in apparent defiance of law is, okay, I'll give you an example explained by an attorney. You can get a patent on something, and the patent's published, and someone violates your patent. What happens? Who sues? You do. If you don't sue, nothing happens. You have the right, you have the law on your side, but if you don't put a case together, nothing happens. It's the same way with your parental rights. It's the same way with your reach into education. There are laws out there at the national level that state that you have certain rights. But you know what? Until a president is entered into in a courtroom defining the parameters of what that right is, nothing's going to happen. And the left is dependent on making it too expensive for you to litigate so that you back down and go along with it. That's the way this game works. So we got to man up. But in the meantime, you need to be ready for a little bit of civil disobedience. Do not go along. You can't do that. Because you know what? All of those people that feel the way you feel are going to go along too. And you more than likely are the majority. I'll give you a quick example of a study, true study. It was one of I used to do some, I was taking a class on Peter Drucker's management techniques, and he had a bunch of different lab things that he did. So they brought a bunch of people in that were supposed to be there for a job interview. They put one guy, one girl in separate rooms, and they did it over and over again. They put a phone in the room, and they pumped smoke in through the vent. And you know what happened when there was a single person in the room? That person almost immediately picked up that phone, called somebody, and said, "There's smoke coming in the vent." Then they put 5 people in the rooms. You know what happened? They all looked at each other. This is human behavior. When I was with the government, don't tell them, you know how I would get my decisions signed off on? I would invite as many people to a meeting as possible. Then I would make a statement of the affirmative, and no one had the nerves to challenge me. I did it every time. They just came in and said it in a very authoritative way, "Do we have agreement?" They all looked at each other, and eventually one person nodded a little bit, and then it was, "Of course, yeah, we're good." And I made sure that that was entered into the agenda, because they didn't usually remember that they agreed with me. And they would say, "Who made that decision?" I would say, "Well, you did." And then I'd whip out the memo, and they would just look confused. I'm like, so one person figured out what I was doing, but that's human behavior, right? We're corrupt. No other species comes together in the millions and lives together and don't even know them. But yet, we feel safer together. That's something that the left uses against us. It's not in our nature to fight. We want to cooperate. We want to be kind. We want to show our best side always. It's not natural to be confrontational. So that means that those few people who have learned through either hardship or radicalization to be confrontational, they know how to control you, and they know how to beat you, because you'll back down. At this point in history, you cannot do this. What you do when you leave this room will determine the future for your families, for your communities, for your country. You can no longer tolerate it. You can no longer be silent. You can no longer speak softly. The government works for you, not you for them. But the problem with this government is it no longer trusts us with our freedoms. They oppose the Second Amendment. Why? Because you can't be trusted with your freedom. We want to censor you because you can't be trusted with your freedom to speak. You're going to say the wrong thing. We don't trust you to raise your child. Somebody said, well, that's not in the Constitution. It's in the preamble. Did you know parents' right is in the preamble of the Constitution? We the people of the United States shall reform our perfect union, establish justice, and secure domestic tranquility, to ordain and establish this Constitution, right? Right? So you want to secure the blessings of liberties for yourself and your prosperity? You know what that is? This whole thing is created for you to exercise, for the freedom to be there for you to exercise, to do what you need to do for your family. Your posterity is your family. So for your posterity, the purpose of the Constitution is parental rights. That's why it's not in the Bill of Rights, because it is the purpose of the Constitution. Because without the building block of the family and the freedom in those families, we don't have a country. Does it make sense? Am I sounding a little crazy? So I'm gonna put some things out, and this is I'm speaking specifically right now to those people that are running for office and who are considering to run for office. If you're running for a congressional office, you need to be smart. I've been hearing out there that people are promising to do all kinds of stuff. Well, be blunt and don't be fooled. No matter who wins the midterm elections, we're still going to have Joe Biden in the presidency for 2 years. So everyone that says they're going to pass this law, pass that law, it's a bunch of garbage. And if they focus on that, they're not going to be doing what they need to be doing. What they need to be doing for those 2 years is transparency. You know why Glenn Youngkin won? He won because the move against parents was exposed publicly, and Democrats and Republicans and independents said no. And the reason why the federal government does things in the dark is so that Americans won't rise up. The only thing you should do for those 2 years, there needs to be hearings on everything. There needs to be a special commission examining the response to the COVID-19 virus. There needs to be a concerted effort on the part of everyone in Congress and the Senate to declassify as much material as possible and put it in the public domain. And those subcommittees need to demand from the executive branch that they provide a reason why something is to be hid from the public. Because not making things public is how they control the narrative. And they only change when it's about to come out. And when it's and it's going to affect an election. I mean, that's why Fauci went in hiding. Why no one wants to talk about it. I haven't seen Hunter around in months. Because light has an antiseptic effect on corruption. And when we allow our government to hold that information because they're smarter than we are, that's how this stuff happens. So for 2 years, that's all we need to be doing, is hearing after hearing, commission after commission, as much information out there as possible, raw dumps, no matter what it is. I want to see the correspondence that took place before the Keystone Pipeline was shut down. Right? I want to know how getting oil from 6,600 miles away by truck and ship is more environmentally sound than getting it from 1,100 miles away by pipeline. Amen. That stuff needs to be in the public. So that's something that just has to happen. That's all they're going to be do those 2 years is transparency. And the other thing is form coalitions within the House, the legislative departments, so that we don't back down on things. Because what's going to happen is, going to take the House, going to take the Senate, and there's going to be a disproportionate number of people who are career rhinos. Ones who were with Trump when he was popular, and when he got assaulted, they turned on him. So you only need 20 members of the House and 10 members of the Senate to stop them. Tea Party did it. right? So what do I mean by that? You have to have enough to stop a floor vote, to make sure it's going nowhere. If I have 10 senators, right, a lot of legislation has to have 60 votes to pass. And you have to be willing to wield power. I'm not voting for this if you don't do this. I'm not voting for this unless you tell me, convinces me, and then I can consult with my constituency about the cost of this. Oh, and by the way, because we can do it, should we do it, let's give it through this litmus test. Freedom first. Does any piece of legislation impede the freedom of the American people? And if it does, the American people need consent on that bill to yield their freedom. Every member of the House and Senate needs to sign off on that and stick to it. In the House as well, with 20 votes, you can stop almost anything. So if you have 30 people in a strong coalition, we can take our government back. There are 535 members of Congress, 100 members of the Senate. We've had 117 Congresses. And in 117 Congresses, they've all been elected by people who promise to spend more money and take more of your freedom. It's unsustainable. By the time we get to the 217th Congress, we're going to be screwed. We'll be broke and freedomless. It's not sustainable. It makes no... Am I the only one that's going, what are you doing? It makes no sense. We have to put ourselves in a position, and we have to stand up, and we have to do some things that are going to be painful. So, ladies, I'm going to speak to you now, and I'll be blunt, okay? You have to work with your friends to keep emotions out of policy. Those emotions and policy is what the rhinos use to spend all our money. When we had votes to stop immigration and someone paraded a kid out there, the woman vote shifted. Oh, but the poor baby's just coming in to be fed. As long as that's done, the doors will always be open. I'm just being blunt. I did a study. I literally sat down and watched the debates of all of the races that were marginal between Republicans and Democrats. I looked at the Virginia race with Wexton, and I sat there. I spent 2 weeks, and God, it was boring. But you know who the winner was? The one with the loudest emotional language. The Republican of the race lost mostly because even if it was a female, when they did not speak to the emotional language of the electorate. And the swing vote in those states, in those elections, were the number of women who voted for one candidate or the other. In order to correct things in this country, some people have to experience pain. The way you get someone to work for food is by not giving them. Right? But you're going to be called cruel, inhuman, you're a monster. Right? And as conservatives, we have to get used to being called a monster when we do the right thing. Right? Because they gave food to people when the jobs moved away to be compassionate and created a permanent system of poverty that has lasted generations. Right? It was government policy that did this. Right? You know, every major crisis in our government over the last 50 years has been caused by the government of one or two administrations before. You know the Great Recession that Obama got all the praise for, that Republicans don't seem to be able to rebuff? Well, Barney Frank pushed through the Community Reinvestment Act. And the free market told the government that some people can't afford to buy houses, therefore we probably shouldn't give them loans. But the Democrats pushed through a bill to make it possible for people that the free market said shouldn't have houses to get houses. And what was the swing? Oh, everyone wants to have the dream. We got to give them some way. Somehow it can work. The markets are wrong. They're just greedy. And what happened? They gave interest-only mortgage payments for the first 3 to 5 years, $300-$400 a month. when the full mortgage kicked in, it was $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a month. The market collapsed, the economy collapsed, and then we elected someone from the same party who broke it to fix it. And blamed the guy who had nothing to do with it. No, it was Bush's mismanagement. No, it was already in the mix. And you can go through everything, gas prices, inflation. You can go through everything, and you can point to the policy of a previous Democrat administration or current administration that they caused the problem. We look at poverty, they caused the problem. We look at racial issues, they caused the problem. You kind of read my mind on one thing about disparity. Disparities are a snapshot in time, right? When you measure disparities over time, we call that a trend, right? But a disparity, and a disparity at any given point in time doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? Big question I always got is, the wealth gap proves that there's racial discrimination, right? And I ask the question, where does most wealth come from? It comes from your home, or from your parents' home, whom you inherited from. What controls the price of your home? Good schools, low crime. What don't black communities have? Good schools, low crime. There's always going to be a wealth gap until those communities have good schools and low crime. And low crime is self-inflicted. 7,000, I think it's 2015, last full year of the statistics, 7,400 blacks were murdered. 6,600 were murdered by other blacks in their same community. That is a huge number. Huge. And it's about equal to all other murders across the country. Just black on black crime in isolated communities. So do you feel armed? Are you ready to fight?
Yes.
Are you ready to fight? I heard yes. Yes. You gotta get some passion behind this. You gotta get some emotion behind this. You have to learn. I want you, get this tape or whatever I want you to read, I want you to study. I want you to practice in the mirror on how to answer your friends when they say idiotic stuff about CRT, right? When they tell you CRT is not taught in the schools, it's not. It's being implemented in the schools. So there's no class. The philosophy is being implemented. And you know when they talk about concepts like anti-racism, understand what anti-racism is. I've read Chris's book. I love Chris's book. It is very simple. It is short. It has quizzes at the back of it. You get through it, you will understand it. It'll give you a framework to think about these things. And you don't regurgitate things back from the book. You know what you do? Understand it, put it in your heart. Because it is at the human level that we make change. And I'll end with this statement. We cannot take back the country with gimmicks. We can only take back the country over time because we lost it over time by winning the hearts and minds of our neighbors. We cannot simply accept that a particular district is going blue or red. We have to be willing to stand up and reason with the people in that community through active involvement in local politics, in the school districts, and with our children to change it. I was commenting before, one of the things that just ticked me off watching the news is when we had pundits on television talking about that kids need to be back in school because they're getting depressed, they're committing suicide, and it's emotionally damaging them. And nobody stopped to think, what you're telling me is kids are falling apart because they're being forced to spend time with their family. Why is this a conservative argument? That's an example of Dallas versus Washington. It's because the Democrats wanted it that the conservatives found some argument for it, when the argument was stupid. Those kids should have been happier at home with their families, and they should have not wanted to go back. At home, they should have been learning from their parents. It doesn't have to be what they're teaching in school. They could have been in a learning, active environment, being engaged with their parents, but we've forgotten how to be parents. We're mad at the schools about CRT, and yet we want to force them to be open to send kids back to CRT? Does that make sense to you? You got to think this kind of stuff through. right? I'm watching, it's crazy when we do that. It's crazy. We have to be smart in terms of policy. And this is my last point, okay? And this is an example of something that we had that we lost. We elected a majority based upon, a congressional majority based upon Americans not liking Obamacare. You remember this? We had the White House, we had Senate, and we had the House. What did we do? We blew it. Why? Why did we blow it? No, because we took a position to overturn something we didn't have the alternatives. In other words, we were talking and we weren't planning or thinking. We came up with no alternatives. One of the things that I actually sat down with my congressional representative at the time, there's an alternative, and this is common sense if you step back and think about it. You know why healthcare costs are out of control? Because we conflate healthcare with health insurance. There's actually three things going on that should not be together. In Obamacare, we have preventative care, which is not insurance. We have incidental or accidental care, which is risk-based insurance. And then we have long-term care, or chronic care, which is not insurance. Let's look at the automobile industry. The way we work it would be as if for your car, when you needed an oil change, you took it and you would go to your insurance company to pay the bill. Or, if you didn't have a car, you go and you buy a car that's already wrecked, and then you take it to your insurance company to fix it. That's what we're doing in healthcare, and then we wonder why the costs are going up. And then what happens when I take 100 doctors who have 1,000 patients, and then I take the same 100 doctors and give them 10,000 patients? Right? So we pass a bill with no provisions to train more doctors. And the reason why medical school costs are going up is because there are less doctors who make more money, which means they're going to up the tuition. But there's no plan to do the whole kind of crazy supply and demand thing. So the position that I had put out before, that I could not get is to take out preventative care. We know how much it costs for a doctor's appointment, how much it costs for some eyeglasses. We can know what that costs. And we make that a fixed cost rider. And then we take the part that's incidental care, and we let that be pure insurance based on risk pools. Those costs will drop precipitously because you've separated out the cost of fixed care from incidental care. Now, what do we do about chronic care? Again, we're so compassionate, we're worried about that, pre-existing conditions. We have a situation like that in the flood insurance market. If you live in a flood zone, you can't buy commercial flood insurance. That's a federal program. So if you really want the government to help in any way that will keep the cost down, you take chronic care and recurring conditions and you make that a subsidized federal insurance program like flood insurance. And so the cost of that type of care is not in the pool. It goes down for everyone. And then if you want pre-care, the idea of preventative care is the government is forcing you to do something you don't want to do. It's your right whether or not you want to take care of yourself or not, right? If you want to, smoke and die on the sidewalk, you can do that. It's not the government's position to tell you, no, you can't do that. In my position, you give an incentive. If you have preventative care, it reduces the cost of your incidental care. Because in theory, by having the preventative care, it reduces the number of incidents that you're going to have. That would fix health insurance. I've actually run this by executives in about 5 or 6 insurance companies just on insurance models. I used to be a medical executive who did health insurance. And no one can tell me why that wouldn't work. Republicans need alternative proposals. We need to stop and think about things. That's why when I talk about rational conservatism means that we no longer have just the luxury of adapting the terminology of our leaders and not understanding what we're talking about. And that's why we're losing this fight, because we can't explain this to our friends, families. My brothers and sisters were all Democrats, just like me. We got one Dem left, and he's a real weak Dem. My mother, my brother, a couple of years ago, he lectured me on the virtues of Obama. One day I came to him and I said, I need you to explain to me about abortion. And he says, why? I don't know if you know this, in New York State, more black children are aborted than born live. And that's the case in a lot of the major cities. There's 54,000 blacks aborted, and 50,000 were born. And I said, how can you support a party that basically supports the extermination of half your own race? And he said, oh, I'm not a Democrat anymore. So go forward in peace. Love you all. And hope we take something good away from this and make some changes right here in Maryland. Be blessed.